Self-condemnation is not moral strength. It is moral paralysis disguised as virtue. When a person constantly replays their mistakes, judging themselves with relentless cruelty, they are not practicing responsibility, they are building a prison. The mind becomes a courtroom where the sentence never ends, and the judge and the accused are the same person. This endless self-accusation doesn't produce transformation. It breeds despair. The tragedy is that the more you punish yourself internally, the less capable you become of creating the change you desperately long for. It's not humility to stay stuck in guilt. It's fear masquerading as integrity. There's a dangerous illusion in self-condemnation, the belief that if you suffer enough, your suffering will somehow pay for your mistakes. But guilt does not erase the past. Only understanding and change can do that. The truth is, when you keep reliving what went wrong, you're not redeeming yourself. You're reinforcing your own brokenness. You start to believe you are your mistake rather than someone who made one. And once that identity sets in, it poisons everything you touch: relationships, goals, even your capacity to love. You become the jailer of your own mind, locking away the possibility of growth. What self-condemnation really steals from you is perspective. When you're trapped in guilt, you see yourself through the narrow lens of failure. You forget that the same capacity that led you to err is also the capacity that allows you to learn. Every human being carries contradictions, potential for both darkness and light. But the condemned mind cannot see light without immediately shadowing it with shame. It's like trying to heal a wound while continuously reopening it. You cannot move forward when you refuse to stop bleeding. Freedom begins when you realize that guilt has served its purpose. Guilt, in its purest form, is not your enemy. It's an alarm system. It rings to alert you that something is wrong and needs to be made right. But once you've heard the alarm, staying in that noise forever only leads to exhaustion. The point of guilt is not to dwell in it, but to respond to it, to reflect, to change, to take responsibility, and then to move forward with wisdom. The moment you stop treating guilt as a home and start seeing it as a signal, you reclaim your agency. The door of this psychological prison is never locked from the outside. It's the prisoner who holds the key. Forgiveness, real, honest forgiveness, is not about denying what you did, but about refusing to let it define the totality of who you are. You acknowledge the mistake, you make amends if you can, and then you decide to stop kneeling before your own past. That decision is not weakness, it's moral courage. Because to forgive yourself is to stand up again, not as the same person, but as someone who has looked into their own darkness and chosen to walk toward the light. That's not escaping judgment, that's transcending it. Forgiveness is one of the most misunderstood acts of strength in human experience. People often assume that to forgive is to forget, to pretend that the past never happened, to erase the pain, or to dismiss the damage. But that is not forgiveness, that is denial. True forgiveness does not require blindness, it demands clarity. It's the conscious choice to face what happened with open eyes, to acknowledge the full weight of your mistakes, and yet decide that they will not dictate the rest of your life. Forgetting is a form of weakness because it refuses to confront. Forgiving is an act of power because it reclaims control over what once held you captive. When you refuse to forgive yourself, you hand the past the authority to rule your present. Every regret, every wrong decision becomes a shadow that follows you, whispering that you are unworthy of peace. But the moment you forgive yourself, you reclaim the narrative. You stop being a victim of what was and start becoming the author of what will be. Forgiveness doesn't mean excusing your actions. It means owning them so fully that they lose the power to define you. It's not self-deception, it's self-liberation. It's standing before your own conscience and saying, yes, I was flawed, but I am not finished. That is the essence of reclaiming power, to no longer live under the tyranny of your own guilt. To forgive is to convert pain into wisdom. The past remains what it is, unchangeable, but your relationship with it can evolve. When you forgive, you turn what once was chaos into a source of structure and understanding. You extract meaning from your suffering instead of letting it fester as shame. In that process, forgiveness transforms from a sentimental act into a form of psychological alchemy, turning the lead of regret into the gold of self-awareness. You begin to see that every scar holds instruction, every loss carries a message, and every fall reveals a truth about your limits and your strength. But forgiveness is not a one-time act, it is a process, a discipline. Every time the memory of your failure resurfaces, forgiveness must be renewed. It's like tending to a wound that takes time to heal. You don't forgive once and become pure. You forgive again and again until the power of the past dissolves. This repetition isn't weakness, it's the steady rebuilding of trust within yourself. Each act of self-forgiveness reclaims another fragment of your spirit that guilt once imprisoned. And slowly, you begin to walk lighter, speak kinder to yourself, and see hope where there was once only remorse. Forgiveness, in the end, is not about rewriting history, it's about rewriting your identity. The past remains etched in the story of who you are, but it no longer defines your destiny. By forgiving yourself, you are saying, I am not just the sum of my failures, I am also the sum of my transformations. That is what it means to reclaim power, to take back authorship of your life from the hands of regret. The paradox is beautiful. The moment you stop trying to forget, you finally remember not just what happened, but who you are capable of becoming. Shame is one of the most powerful emotional forces in human life, and also one of the most misunderstood. Many people treat shame as something inherently toxic, something to be avoided at all costs. But the truth is, shame itself isn't the enemy. It's the relationship you form with it that determines whether it destroys you or transforms you. Shame arises when you realize you have violated your own moral order. It is the signal that your actions have fallen short of your values. In that sense, it's not a curse but a compass. It points toward where growth is needed. When interpreted properly, shame becomes an invitation to realign yourself with truth. When ignored or suppressed, however, it becomes a tyrant that rules your mind through fear and self-loathing. The tragedy of modern life is that many people have lost the ability to differentiate between healthy shame and toxic shame. Healthy shame says, I did something wrong. Toxic shame whispers, I am something wrong. That single shift in perspective changes everything. One leads to reflection and renewal. The other leads to paralysis and despair. If you carry the belief that you are fundamentally unworthy, you become incapable of growth because the foundation of learning, the belief that you can change, has already been destroyed. That's how shame becomes a tyrant. It convinces you that your worst moment is your true identity. Yet, when you face shame honestly, without denial, without defiance, it can become a powerful teacher. It shows you where you've drifted from integrity, where you need to rebuild strength, and where you have to take responsibility. This kind of shame doesn't crush your spirit, it refines it. It transforms moral pain into moral wisdom. When you allow shame to teach you instead of enslaving you, you start to see your flaws as lessons rather than labels. You begin to understand that mistakes, however painful, are necessary components of growth. They strip away arrogance and force you to confront the truth about yourself. The raw, uncomfortable truth that you are imperfect but still redeemable. Learning from shame requires humility, the willingness to admit you were wrong without drowning in self-hatred. Humility is what separates guilt that heals from guilt that kills. The person who learns from shame asks, what is this emotion trying to tell me? Rather than, why am I such a failure? That shift turns shame from a destructive fire into a purifying one. It burns away false pride and moral laziness, leaving behind the ashes from which a stronger self can rise. The key is not to silence shame, but to listen to it wisely, to extract its message without surrendering to its cruelty. When shame becomes a teacher, it opens the path to compassion, both for yourself and for others. You start to realize that everyone carries hidden burdens, that moral failure is a universal human experience, not a personal curse. This understanding doesn't make you weaker. It makes you human, and from that humanity grows empathy, maturity, and grace. The greatest paradox of all is that by learning from shame, you become less controlled by it. You move from being its prisoner to being its student, and eventually its master. The tyrant dissolves, and in its place stands a teacher, stern but honest, painful but necessary, guiding you toward the kind of peace that can only be earned through self-understanding. Redemption is not granted by chance. It is earned through responsibility. You cannot simply wish your way out of the consequences of your past. To be redeemed is to rebuild trust with yourself and the world through consistent, conscious action. Responsibility is the path that connects guilt to transformation, regret to wisdom, and failure to purpose. Without responsibility, forgiveness becomes hollow, just another escape from accountability. But when you take responsibility, you reclaim the moral authority to change. You stop being a victim of circumstance and start becoming the architect of meaning. This is where redemption begins, when you stop saying, "Why did this happen to me?" and start asking, "What can I do now to make it right?" Responsibility is difficult because it demands confrontation, not with others, but with yourself. It requires looking directly at the chaos you have created and admitting your role in it. Most people avoid this because it's excruciating to face the gap between who you were and who you should have been. But avoidance only deepens the wound. The longer you run from the truth, the more your conscience corrodes, until guilt becomes unbearable. Taking responsibility, then, is not a burden, it's a release. It transforms pain into direction. It replaces helplessness with purpose. The moment you say, "I am accountable," you shift from being an object of your past to being an agent of your future. Yet, responsibility is not merely confession, it's correction. It's not enough to admit your mistakes. You must take deliberate steps to rectify them. Every act of responsibility, even the smallest, reclaims a piece of your lost integrity. When you face those you've hurt, when you make amends, when you choose discipline over indulgence, you start to rebuild the internal order that guilt once shattered. Responsibility demands effort because redemption is not an emotional experience. It is a moral reconstruction. You must remake yourself brick by brick through actions that align with truth. It's a slow process, but each step restores a part of your humanity that self-condemnation had stolen. There's a profound paradox here. The moment you accept full responsibility, you also experience your first taste of freedom. Because now you are no longer chained to the illusion that someone else must fix your life for you. You stop blaming circumstances, parents, fate, or God. You realize that while you may not control what happened, you absolutely control what happens next. That realization ignites a spark of redemption within the soul, the understanding that responsibility is not punishment, it's empowerment. It's the foundation upon which new life is built. To take responsibility is to take the first breath of moral rebirth. Ultimately, redemption is not about perfection, it's about alignment. Responsibility aligns your actions with your values, your words with your conscience, and your potential with your reality. It allows you to walk upright again, not as someone pretending to be flawless, but as someone who has faced their darkness and emerged honest, humbled, and whole. This bridge, built of honesty, courage, and action, carries you from the ruins of your past to the possibilities of your future. And when you walk across it, you discover that redemption was never about escaping judgment. It was about earning back your self-respect. Because the one who takes responsibility no longer needs to beg for forgiveness. They become the living proof of it. True peace is not found in running away from your darkness, but in learning to live with it consciously. Most people spend their lives trying to deny, bury, or erase the parts of themselves they find shameful, their fears, their failures, their impulses, their regrets. They believe peace will come when those parts are gone, but denial doesn't create peace, it creates fragmentation. You become divided within yourself, one part pretending to be whole while the other part silently bleeds. Integration, on the other hand, means acknowledging every aspect of who you are, the noble and the broken, the courageous and the cowardly, and bringing them into dialogue rather than conflict. You can only find stillness when the war inside you finally ends, and that happens not through denial, but through understanding. The human psyche is complex, layered, and full of contradictions. Within every individual exists both light and shadow, the capacity for creation and destruction, kindness and cruelty, strength and weakness. Denial tries to eliminate one side of that equation, but integration learns to balance it. The person who seeks peace through suppression ends up haunted by what they refuse to face. The repressed shadow doesn't disappear, it resurfaces in anger, anxiety, or self-sabotage. But when you confront it honestly, you discover that it carries wisdom. The anger might reveal your boundaries. The guilt might expose your values. The fear might remind you of your vulnerability. Integration turns your inner chaos into a coherent narrative. Every part of you begins to serve a purpose instead of waging war against the rest. Integration requires brutal honesty. You have to look at yourself without filters to see not only who you wish to be, but who you truly are. That's uncomfortable because it shatters illusions of innocence and superiority, but it's also liberating. When you stop hiding from your flaws, you stop living in fear of exposure. You become authentic, grounded, and stable. Denial breeds fragility because it depends on illusion. Integration breeds resilience because it is built on truth. Peace that is founded on denial is always temporary. One small reminder, one small failure, and it collapses. But peace born of integration is enduring because it is honest. It accepts the storm as part of the sky. To integrate is not to justify your darkness, but to own it. You don't celebrate your flaws, you contain them. You give your impulses structure and direction. You channel your aggression into strength, your guilt into growth, your pain into empathy. That's the essence of mature peace, not a numb calmness, but an active harmony between the opposing forces within you. Integration transforms conflict into cooperation. It allows you to say, yes, this is who I am, imperfect, evolving, capable of both harm and healing, and yet I choose to act toward good. That choice, repeated daily, becomes the foundation of inner peace. When you finally integrate yourself, you realize that peace is not a destination, but a relationship with truth. You stop seeking escape and start embracing awareness. You stop pretending to be perfect and start striving to be whole. The divided self finds unity, and the noise within quiets down, not because it has disappeared, but because it has been understood. This is the peace of a person who has looked into their own abyss and no longer fears it. Integration brings you home, not to an idealized version of yourself, but to the real one. And in that reunion between your light and your shadow, you discover something sacred. Peace was never the absence of conflict, it was the presence of acceptance.